Welcome to the inaugural session of the Race and Bias Conversation Series. The Race and Bias Conversation Series was developed to help the graduate school community better understand the many facets of systemic racism and bias, and to keep these issues at the forefront of our consciousness as we work to make Duke a more inclusive and supportive environment. A central question that underlines this series is straightforward. Are we reproducing the very conditions that we are working to transform? And while this question is difficult to fully address, it does require that we are active, thoughtful, and focused in our efforts. Before we get started, there are a few items that I would like to briefly review. First, please note that tonight's event is being recorded and may be made available to the public at a later date. If you would prefer to not have your picture or information appear as part of the recording, then please keep your camera turned off and your microphone on mute throughout the event. Second, because of the number of attendees, we would ask that you keep your microphone muted and use the chat box to submit questions. During the event, if you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat and will pose audience questions to our featured guest. And finally, as a reminder, please keep the discussion in the chat respectful and relevant to the topic of conversation. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Paula D. McLean, who will lead tonight's conversation on desegregating private higher education in the South. Dr. McLean is a James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Professor of Public Policy, Dean of the Graduate School, and Vice Provost for Graduate Education. Dr. McLean, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramos. You must have been speaking to my mom's spirit because that was a great introduction. Thank you very much. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a book that I particularly like. It's by Melissa Keene. She is a Centennial Professor of History at Rice University, and it's Desegregating Private Higher Education in the South, Duke, Emory, Rice, Tulane, and Vanderbilt. Now, Keene takes a chronological approach to looking at each of these institutions through the decades of the 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s. At the time, these were all very good regional undergraduate institutions. But after World War II, they were now striving to expand their institutional missions to become leading research institutions on a national scale. They wanted to compete nationally for the best students and faculty, yet their identities as Southern institutions and Southern defined in terms of their racial strictures continued to get in the way of making this shift. The primary barriers for all 5 of these institutions was their board of trustees that consisted of local and state business people with little or no knowledge about how to build a national university. Control of the decision-making at these institutions at basically all levels was controlled by the board of trustees and not by the presidents of these institutions. And Keene looks at how presidents of these institutions at the time, Harvey Branscombe at Vanderbilt, Arthur Hollis Edens, and later Darrell Hart at Duke, Rufus Harris at Tulane, Walter Houston at Rice, and Goodrich Wright and Walter Martin at Emory. The focus is on the institutional leadership moving their institutions toward desegregation at the same time where they're trying to maintain their jobs, while all faced with a recalcitrant board of trustees. Now, Branscombe at Vanderbilt, while by no means easy, appears to have had the most success. while Eden's at Duke, our institution, the least. And one connection between the two institutions is that Branscombe left Duke Divinity School to go to Vanderbilt to be president or chancellor. And it was at the Duke Divinity School in the 1940s that really were the engine that continued to send letters and petitions forward to their dean, who sometimes sent them forward, but it never really got to the Board of Trustees to approve the admission of Blacks to the Divinity School. Branscombe, my apologies, would have been considered a progressive at the time because he recognized that the winds were blowing away from segregation and that in order to be a national research institution, Vanderbilt was going to have to come to terms with letting go of segregation. Eden's at Duke, on the other hand, was a cautious president who held on to the concept of educational segregation, while at times talking about how those qualified Blacks would be a credit to Duke if allowed to be on campus, but he was not pushy about that position. The Board of Trustees at Duke, however, refused to engage in a conversation about integration. And Keene has a segment in the conclusion from the memoir of the Duke chaplain Barney Jones that described the problem that Eden's encountered. Jones said that Eden's faced a Board of Trustees determined to keep Blacks out of the university as long as possible. Whenever Eden's would tentatively suggest that maybe the Board of Trustees needed to discuss the issue, as Jones said, that was relayed to him by Eden's, there would be a prolonged silence around the table until the chairman would ask, "Is there any other business to come before the board?" Now, Vanderbilt decided in 1953 to admit a student to the Divinity School. In fact, it's James Joseph, and I may have gotten the first name incorrect, but he actually ended up going on the Vanderbilt Board of Trustees. And in 1956, moved to admit a student or two into the law school. Branscombe recognized the external forces that were at play against segregation in foundations. The Association of American Law Schools had had a number of proposed resolutions to remove accreditation from law schools that maintained segregation. And eventually, after Brown versus Board of Education and the 1957 Civil Rights Commission, the federal government was putting in place restrictions on giving federal money to educational institutions that maintained segregation. And then foundations, Carnegie, Ford, and the General Education Corporation of the Rockefeller Foundation were also beginning to put restrictions on to whom and to which institutions they were going to give money to. But despite Vanderbilt's, kind of out in front approach to issues of desegregation, and this redounds to Branscombe, Vanderbilt was not able to escape the Black student sit-ins and demonstrations in Nashville. And Branscombe actually, some people would think, mishandled the expulsion of James Lawson from the Divinity School in 1960. And the national publicity and everything that redounded to that was not good for Vanderbilt. But Branscombe, you know, still in that time would have been considered a progressive. Now, the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, for several of these institutions, actually hardened the views of some of the members of the Board of Trustees to maintain segregation, but did push the issue of desegregation to the forefront at places like Emory. Keene talks about the case of massive resistance that Georgia was going to implement, and the debate in Atlanta about shutting down the public school system to avoid having to integrate the schools. At that time, Goodrich, Martin was now president. Goodrich Wright was no longer president of Emory, and Martin was president. And he knew that those faculty that could leave Emory were going to do so. In fact, he received the resignation letters at his home of either 13 or 15 members of the divinity faculty when he about this issue, and that he also knew that it was going to be really difficult for Emory to replace these faculty if in fact they left. And I might have gotten, I have to apologize, I think I may have gotten the story of Branscombe receiving the letters of resignation from the divinity faculty over his handling of the James Lawson, but Martin also encountered a lot of divisions among his faculty over how the Atlanta school system was going to be handled. And as important as the histories of these other institutions are, and how each was able to navigate the desegregation of their institutions, I think for us, the story of Duke's recalcitrance in maintaining a segregated institution held back its desire to become a national research institution. What I find fascinating about the Duke story is how the cautious and pragmatic approach of Hollis Edens did not move the needle much at all. He was very concerned about driving a wedge between himself and the board really controls so much of the decision making that Edens really had very little ability to make any type of moves. Despite his own feeling, as I said before, that maybe having a few qualified Blacks at Duke would be beneficial to Duke. But you know, it took his sudden resignation and the removal as Paul Gross as vice president for educational, vice president of the educational division, which is what we now call the office of the provost. A new team was brought in, a new president, Darrell Hart, who had been the former chair of surgery in the School of Medicine. Taylor Cole from my Department of Political Science, who had also been a former president of the American Political Science Association, was made provost. And Barnes Woodhall of the Medical Center, Frank DeVivre, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that name, for the professional schools, and Marcus Hobbs, who later became the dean of the graduate school, were brought in by Hart as part of this administrative team. Keene walks through their approach to the board on understanding that the Board of Trustees was not going to be swayed by any appeal to a moral high ground about why segregation was immoral and why Duke should do the right thing. They knew that argument was not going to fly with a board of trustees who basically was determined to maintain segregation. And as they said, the Southern tradition and the Southern way of life at Duke. Now, in a documentary on the graduates that the graduate school did on Ida Stevens Owens, who was one of the first 2 Black PhD students to enter in 1961, the late Crawford Goodwin, who was an assistant to Taylor Cole when Taylor Cole was provost and secretary through the Board of Trustees, talked about the story that King relates about how these individuals approached the Board of Trustees on the subject. And what they basically said is that by not integrating Duke, they were hurting Duke and its reputation. That their holding on to segregation was making it difficult for Duke to become a national institution. In fact, that the strict structures on segregation had become a major hindrance at Duke attaining that national and international recognition that it wanted and it felt that it deserved. They also knew that the Board of Trustees was not going to be swayed by outsiders like the board, Brown versus Board of Education. So they had to put the arguments in terms of how holding on to segregation was harming Duke. That Duke would be hindered in its ability to get federal grants because the federal rules now were not going to give money to segregated institutions. Foundations were not going to give money to segregated institutions. That they would not be able to hire the faculty that they wanted of a national caliber, coming from a national market as opposed to those just in a Southern regional market. And that a number of faculty that were movable would leave Duke and would not be able, and Duke would not be able to replace them. Duke students and faculty were also involved at this particular point. And again, the divinity faculty were in the forefront of pushing this. The sit-ins in Greensboro by North Carolina A&T students, joined by students from Guilford College and other places, began to push the Duke Board of Trustees to realize that, well, it wasn't that easy, but that they were not going to be able to hang on to segregation. Now, what Hart and his team did was that they had a series of reports that they had done where, and as King goes through, they listed how much federal money they were going to lose from grants if they didn't deal with the issue of doing away with segregation. They held a series of meetings. They traveled to meet with the Board of Trustees members in Charlotte and other places in North Carolina. And so in February of 1961, when they finally brought the proposal of desegregating narrowly graduate and professional schools only at that time to the board, they were able to get, and I'm sorry that I can't remember, I know they had some negative votes, but they actually got agreement to open admission to Black students in the graduate school and in the professional programs. So in the fall of 1961, Ida Stevens Owens and James Rowland Law entered PhD programs in the graduate school. Ida Owens in physiology and James Law in psychology. Now, there's a backstory to these two individuals. It wasn't that Duke just opened up and said, we're going to take applications now from Black students, to come into our graduate school. But Daniel Tosteson, who was the chair of the physiology department at Duke, who went on to be dean of the medical school at the University of, not the medical, but Department of Cell Biology, I believe, at the University of Chicago, and then became dean of the medical school at Harvard University, is credited with nationally of changing how medical education was presented and developed and what curricula should be part of a med school. But at this time, in 1961, he was chair of the physiology department at Duke University. And he was committed to admitting Black students to his PhD program. And to do that, he traveled around North Carolina to HBCUs. And he went over to then the North Carolina College, which is now the University of North Carolina Central University, talked to the chair of biology, James Lee, and identified Ida Stevens to come into the PhD program in physiology. He purposely went out and recruited her to come into his graduate program. And he did this in later years as well. Now, James Law, I know Ida Stevens Owen's story and Daniel Tosteson. I can only surmise about James Rowland Law's story. He had graduated from Lincoln University in 1947 and went to New York University and received a master's degree in 1949 in psychology. He then went to work in many different positions at Johnson C. Smith University. Johnson C. Smith is one of the universities that's supported by the Duke Endowment. Duke University is one of those. I surmise that when the Board of Trustees made this decision about admitting Blacks to the graduate school, and that there, I believe, were 3 trustees from the Duke Endowment on the Board of Trustees, that they identified James Rowland Laws to come to Duke to enroll in the psychology PhD program. Both he and Ida Stevens Owens received their PhDs in 1967, and Rowland Laws returned to Johnson C. Smith, where he served in a number of positions and became the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Johnson C. Smith. Also at that time, Walter Thaniel Johnson and David Robinson entered the law school in 1961. I do not know their stories, but I'm assuming and I hope that those of our colleagues in the law school do know the story of their particular recruitment. Hart and his, after the successful admission of 4 students, 2 to the graduate school and 2 to the law school, Hart and his team circled back and decided that they wanted to do the entire desegregation of Duke University. And so on June 1st of 1962, the University Council, which is now the Academic Council, passed a resolution basically saying that the university needed to desegregate in its undergraduate colleges. In November, Hart and his team took to the Board of Trustees the resolution and asking for a decision to desegregate the undergraduate colleges, thereby desegregating Duke University. And the Board of Trustees finally voted in November of 1962 to do that. And the first 5 undergraduates entered Duke in 1963. Wilhelmina Rubin Cook, who the old social science building is now named after, Mary Mitchell Harris, Gene Kendall, Cassandra Smith Rush, and Nathan B. White Jr. They all entered in 1963, and I believe all of them received their degrees in 1967. Now, this might seem like a feel-good story all wrapped in a nice bow, but we do know that's not the case. History has a habit of intruding on the present, and there is much left to do to make Duke a truly inclusive and diverse environment. I want to read in terms of the feel-good story that we all want to have about Duke University. There is another book, and it's called The Launching of Duke University 1924 to 1949, which is written by Robert F. Durden. And this book was published in 1993, and he wrote the preface in this in 1992. So all of this history that Keene has identified in this book should have been known when Durden was writing this book. But in the conclusion, and it's the last several paragraphs, Durden is giving a feel-good story about Duke and race. And what he says, and I want to just kind of read this to you. Because he says, in light of Trinity Duke's history, the Duke family's conspicuous fairness towards African Americans, and the cosmopolitan nature of the university's faculty and student body, Duke stood at a crucial junction in 1950s. One would think, and this is a subjunctive sentence, one would think that Duke University might grasp the opportunity to demonstrate in a particularly difficult yet vital area the real leadership in the educational world that J.B. Duke had called for in his indenture. That did not happen. And in 1993, he knew that did not happen. But at the end of this book, we get the feel-good story about the history of Duke. Now, as I said, history has a habit of intruding on the present, and there is much left to do to make Duke truly inclusive and an adverse environment. Emory at this point has had two black provosts. Earl Lewis was appointed in 2014 and served until he became president of the Mellon Foundation in 2012. Dwight McBride was appointed in 2017 and is now the president of the New School in New York. Tulane appointed its first Black dean in 1986, John P. Kramer, as dean of the law school. Duke appointed its first Black dean of one of its 10 schools and colleges in 2012, me. We tend to continue to be behind the curve on many levels as we were in the decades earlier that were covered by Keene. And as I end my presentation of Keene's book, and I really hope if you haven't been able to read it that you do, because it gives you a real sense of history. A question that I would like to pose to the group is how those early attitudes about maintaining Duke as a segregated institution might be present in Duke's culture today. Or is there no relationship at all? Do any of those attitudes from the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s manifest themselves at Duke today? And I'm going to throw it back to Cisco, Dr. Ramos.
Absolutely. So if anybody would like to respond to that question, please use the raise hand feature, and I will call on you shortly after you do.
Do we have any takers, Cisco?
Not yet.
I think I see
Ah,
one.
Raj.
Oh, thanks, Cisco, and thanks, Dr. McLean. I loved your introduction. So I'm about to say something that probably has no basis, empirical basis, but it's just my conjecture or my hypothesis that I think that, you know, the attitudes taken by those early leaders in the 50s and 60s are bound to influence what's happening today. And I think to make the point, I would just pose the counter argument to it is that if those leaders in the 50s and 60s had taken a very, very progressive stance, that I think the institution would grow to take pride in those really progressive actions. And that would be a source of pride for the future generation of leaders and to recruit leaders over the years. And this would really sort of be a self-generative kind of process where this really early progressive action basically produces more, I guess, energy and spirit around this kind of progressive action. And I think you see that in other corporations, in other institutions, and even in nations. And so that's my personal, that's my 2 cents.
No, I think, just let me digress just a bit because I agree with you. I just I'm just finished my term as president of the American Political Science Association, and my presidential address dealt with the early racist origins of American political science and how those origins kind of trained a whole generation of scholars. So why in 2020, scholars who work in race, ethnicity, and politics and scholars of color still find that they are having to battle against issues that one would think would not exist anymore. So I think that your conjecture probably does have some basis in empiricism, although we can't really identify it at that point. But I think you really are onto something at that point.
All right, so we've got a couple more raised hands. We're going to start with King, then Anne, and then Jason. So King. We'll come back to King. Let's go to Anne. Anne, what's your question?
Well, my comment, I think, was responding to what Dean McLean mentioned about residues of this history that may still be present today. And a question that I would have there would be to look at how the racial hierarchies continue to manifest in Duke's overall demographics of the Duke community in terms of its employees in particular. Whether, it would be correct if you looked at faculty employees, staff employees, whether you would still find African-American employees heavily concentrated in lower paid positions, in more menial positions, and how those people are treated on campus. And I know that historically in more recent years there had been conflict in a medical center over issues like that. And so I'm wondering if that is an area that it deserves to be continually looked at.
Oh, and I think you're absolutely right. Which I think is why in a lot of the recent discussions about systemic inequalities at Duke, that there is a focus or questions about staff staff of color and what opportunities they might have at Duke, and what, how they're treated, how they're received, So I think absolutely, absolutely, because one of the things that Keene talks about in the book is that at Duke and others, you know, they were okay with Blacks on campus in menial positions, right? But anything that resembled equality or social equality was a no-no, you know? So Duke always had Blacks on campus. They were just not I mean, they were in basically segregated job categories.
Our next comment comes from Jason Long.
Yeah, thanks so much for allowing me to speak, and thank you, Dean McLean, for that really nice synopsis of the book. I think part of it is also, and I think sort of going off the idea of the early on, what sort of happened was a lot of the students had to sort of prove themselves, and unrightfully so. I think we may agree that the Black students had to put in a lot more effort, potentially. The deans had to go out and search for these people. And I think part of that still manifests itself in the community at Duke still. When we think about Black students and other students of color, that they may be at a disadvantage because of the system that's been in place for that still hasn't gone away, that they have to prove themselves on SATs and ACTs. And I think Duke's starting to try to go away from these types of programs and tests as well. And I think that's a right move, in my opinion. But I think those are still things that students have to prove themselves. And that could be disproportionate. We'd like to hope that they're not, but could be disproportionate on certain students of color versus those that you know, are white and have had a more privileged background from that area as well. So thanks.
Thank you, Jason.
We're going to return to Bill King. Bill King, if you're on the line.
Okay, am I coming through?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm having to learn this process. I was an undergraduate class of 1961 and was here when all of this took place and then continued in graduate school. You will be surprised to know that this was not discussed very much on campus among students. There's an age-old question of how you bring about change. Do you push the envelope or do you work behind the scenes? And believe it or not, the editor of the Chronicle, my senior year, did not write anything about desegregation that year. I found out later when I became university archivist and was looking through the records that he was asked by the administration not to discuss the issue because it would inflame and get in the way of the process that they were trying to put in place. So you will not find an undergraduate position by the Tower of Campus Thought and Action, the Chronicle, which some people can look at today and say, oh, students weren't interested at all. They were very much anxious about it, but that's just an anomaly in our history. Now, all of this was taking place within the Board of Trustees. I saw, it was an entirely different world. I saw Hollis Eden speak to the freshman class in 1957, and the rest of the time he was here, the only time I ever laid eyes on the president was when he was getting his hair cut in the barbershop. Presidents just simply were not visible. The Board of Trustees is a self-perpetuating board. They elect their own membership, and at that time, in the late 50s, the predominant number of board were ministers, Methodist ministers. So the board has completely changed today. It's still a self-perpetuating board. But one of the themes in this that gets overlooked is Duke was going through its most serious administrative crisis at the same time, called the Gross Edens Affair, when there was the Duke Endowment had 3 members on the executive board. The Duke Board of Trustees, which was entirely separate, had 3 members on the executive board, and the executive board was governing the university. And you had this tension between the endowment board and the university board. And so Edens gets caught up in this dramatically. And so he is having to deal with an administrative crisis at the same time. Now, when Terry Sanford became president, there was still a vestige of this around in that there were still some endowment members on the board. And Terry told Charles Wade, the chairman of the board of trustees, I'm not going to become president of Duke unless I have authority over Duke University. Can you assure me that the Duke board governs Duke University? And Wade said yes. And they moved to remove that tie. And you look at the makeup of the board today, there are educators, there are successful businessmen, there are foundation people, there are women, there are blacks. I mean, comparing the board of trustees at the time of desegregation and today is like apples and oranges. And I would say the most significant decision that I've observed in the history of Duke University is the decision to desegregate. It has changed it positively all the way across the board. Now, it has come in fits and starts, and you're exactly right to point that out. But that decision is a keystone in Duke's history.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And the fits and starts is apropos. Thank you.
Our next comment would be from Rossi Clark Cotton.
Yeah, so I'm a graduate student in cell biology. And so with respect to Dean McLean's question about vestiges of this history that we still see with us, one of the things that pops out to me is the dearth of Black faculty in the basic sciences in the medical school. And I think of faculty, particularly Black faculty, their decision to come here or go somewhere else. I think it's a very tough decision to choose to come somewhere where you're making a long-term commitment like that when you see no other Black faculty or you see very few. And so my suspicion is that at least part of the reason that it's difficult now for departments in the basic sciences to recruit Black faculty is that there just haven't been many, and that just perpetuated over a period of years.
Is it that there haven't been many, or they haven't made an effort to actually go out and search for people?
Well, when I say there haven't been many, I mean there haven't, at least during my tenure, there have not been many faculty, whether there were applicants or whether there were interested potential faculty who were not recruited. That's something I have no idea about, but simply looking at the numbers, I have not seen many since I've been here.
Yeah, thanks, Rossi. Yeah.
A question that just came in from the chat is, in your opinion, what role does race and racism play in faculty retention and recruitment?
You know, there are so many vagaries and nuances in faculty recruitment. Just let me give you examples in terms of what I refer to as systemic inequalities that go into faculty recruitment and retention. We know from a lot of the research that's being done in the social sciences and others that there are citation patterns and that exclude that majority scholars don't cite the work of scholars of color, even if the scholars of color were the original ones that did that work. So if you're looking at someone's CV who's applying for a job and you decide to go that you're going to look at their citation count and, you know, using that as a proxy supposedly for how respected their work is, there's a bias in that. And you've kind of bought into the bias by saying citations are an objective measure of how respected the scholar is. So I use that example because these are the vagaries and the small things that go into how one evaluates a file that works against scholars of color and women in some disciplines. And unless faculty are intentional about not buying into those biases, then scholars of color get devalued. And especially, I study race. I'm a political scientist, I study race. For some scholars of color who study race are just studying, it's a study of me, right? You can't be objective because you're studying yourself. But somehow a white scholar studying race can be objective. And a white scholar studying white issues can be objective, but scholars of color somehow cannot. And so we find ourselves having to kind of work against all of these types of biases that play into faculty recruitment. And unless you have people who are prepared to be intentional and to identify what those biases are when you're evaluating files, you're going to continue, or you have this devaluation of the work of scholars of color. And they're not competitive, or they're just, you know, and so it's a slog. It's a slog. Let me just kind of leave it there. But we know a lot of this now from a lot of the research that's been done. And if search committees are really serious and understand what those biases are, then I think the playing field becomes a little bit more level for scholars of color.
Raj.
Sure. Thanks again, Cisco, for letting me contribute. So I wanted to ask about something that I think is very much a pattern of systemic racism that's probably, you know, has a basis in, you know, all the events you talked about in the 50s and 60s, which is this idea of, you know, of making in the admissions process for undergraduates that whether your parents or a family member went to Duke is a factor in the admissions process, the so-called legacy admissions. And I'm very, very, very concerned about this because I feel that this is a very overt and maybe not so often spoken about form of systemic racism. And I think one of the, so I mean, if you look at some elite institutions like Harvard, for example, there's like, I don't know, 25% of the legacy admissions, or among whites, there's 25% legacy admissions. Among African Americans, there's like 3% or something legacy admissions. And I mean, I think those patterns are very similar at most of the elite institutions, Princeton, Stanford, and so on. And I'm assuming Duke, although I don't have any numbers. And I think one of the things that's always raised about, a concern that's raised about doing away with legacy admissions is that it will impact alumni giving. But the data shows that that's not true. I mean, there's several schools that have curtailed legacy admissions, MIT, Caltech, Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, and on and on. So I'm just trying to hear what you guys, Cisco and Dean McClain and so forth have. I mean, what do you think about this, my idea, and what do you think can be done to address it?
No, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know a lot about, I mean, you know, in the graduate school, legacy admissions don't mean anything at all. You know, I mean, that's just not how programs. So I'm not as familiar with kind of undergraduate, you know, legacy admissions at Duke. I don't know how that's handled at Duke, but I do understand the concern that if in fact you've had the benefit of your parent having gone to an institution, and then maybe even your grandfather having gone to an institution, that you, by virtue of that, have a privileged position to get into that institution, regardless of your qualifications, you know. So I think that's a legitimate question. I have no information on how Duke handles legacies. Maybe somebody from undergraduate admission might, but I don't, you know, but I understand your point.
Yeah, this is Steve Peliuka. I don't know, I can't find the hand raising button, but I'll raise my hand. I think there is a legacy policy at Duke and several other schools, but I would observe from being on the board of trustees, the board of trustees is probably the most diverse that it's been, and it is, my opinion, you know, progressive. The student body is diverse and models the country. So if legacy goes on, then if there's 10% African Americans, they'll have 10%. They'll be treated like all the rest of the legacy. So over time, the legacy thing should become less of an issue as you model the population base inside the university. But my question would be, you know, given that I do believe it's a progressive board and much more diverse board than there's ever been at Duke, and there is a big focus on this, and in fact, if I go back and look at the organizations I've been involved with, Bain Capital, the Celtics, and Duke University, you know, all of them, you know, progressive, but we all haven't done, you know, good enough a job on all these issues with unconscious bias. That, you know, reversing 300 years of history doesn't happen overnight, but I think that the recent events have made everybody focus on this and try to double down and triple down. So my question is I think there's a will there. There is a much more diversity. Everyone wants to change this. What do you think the top 3 or 4 action steps at Duke and academia at large are that has to happen to actually make that change, even if there are intentions to do that? And we do have progressive boards, and we are trying to pay, I think, double down on reversing 350 years of bad history on this.
Yeah, I think I have to give a hat tip to our president, Vince Price, because I think I've been at Duke 20 years, and these issues come up, you know, they're cyclical, and it's like we kind of spin our wheels and nothing seems to resolve itself. But I really have, I think Duke is at an inflection point, and I think we have the right president for this time. I mean, I know in a couple of days or so that they'll, well, President Price had his Juneteenth statement, and recently he had all of the senior leadership go through a discussion and a presentation about bias and things. And this, to me, now it may seem, I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, right? Because there is no Pollyanna on my part, but I do think that we're at a point at Duke where we are going to be able to make some progress. After 20 years, I think I'm a little bit more hopeful now than I have been in the past, because people are concerned about identifying unconscious bias. People are concerned about removing the vestiges of systemic inequality that exist at Duke. Do I think it's going to happen totally before I retire? Probably not. But do I think we're going to be in a better place in the next 10 years? Yes, I do. I don't have a silver bullet, But I do think we have the leadership of the university at this point in time that's going to help us get to a better place on race. And like I said, there's no Pollyanna on my part. So I know this is not going to happen, magically. But I do think there is a commitment at Duke at this point that hasn't been there before.
Yeah, I agree. We have the right president, and I think the whole country, including Duke, including all of us, have been more educated about these issues. The education system has been at fault. My mother was a history teacher, and we didn't learn much about Jim Crow, in high school and even in college. So I think we are at hopefully an inflection point. But I also think it can't be a flash in the pan that we focus on it for 1 year. It's probably it's a 50-year program, and hopefully with a lot of progress in the next 10 years with the right ingredients in place. And I'm also hopeful because I've seen it in the big capital, I've seen it with the Celtics, where we're all of us, including Duke, embarking on 10, 20-year programs to reverse this, because it's got to start from the very fundamental building blocks, up to the top. And for the first time, I think we've had a top-down approach that it's not acceptable and has to change.
Yes, and I am hopeful because now we have a focus on staff, right? On the staff that actually keep this university running, right? They're the engine that makes it run. And I think for the first time, we're going to focus on some of their issues as well.
Yeah. And we have some great leaders like Dean Ashby and Stephanie and Janet Hill and Carmichael Roberts. These are incredible people. So I'm hopeful that, that group will continue to attract more incredible people and make a focus on that.
Great.
I want to, as we're bumping up against time, I want to begin by thanking Dean McClain for your time in leading today's discussion. So I'm giving you a virtual applause, if you will. And I want to turn it over to my colleague and dear friend, Assistant Dean, Dr. James Allen Kendrick, to conclude today's session.
Dr. Ramos, Cisco, thank you very much. So this concludes our inaugural Race and Bias Conversation, Desegregating Private Higher Education in the South. So this is just part one of our series. So on behalf of Dean McClain and all of my colleagues in the graduate school, I want to really give a shout out to my assistant dean colleagues, John Ju, for all of your work. I want to thank you, our colleagues and our students and our friends, for your time, for your attendance, and for being a part of this robust conversation. A few housekeeping notes. Please look for an evaluation of this evening's Race and Bias Conversation series in your email inbox, the email that you used when you registered for this event. We want to hear from you, and we are interested in your input to help us improve. As I share my slide with you, I want to make sure that you know about, I believe that's it, that you are aware of part two of our series for the Race and Bias Conversations, Thursday, November 5th, 2020 at 6 p.m. The conversation will be led by PhD students Ajane Clemens in public policy and Arvind Krishnamurthy in political science. The topic will be researching the police. A reminder from us in the graduate school that this is certainly a difficult period for all of us. We will get through it. Remember, take care of yourselves, wear your mask, wash your hands, practice social distancing, stay safe and well. Good evening, survivors.